I'm going to kind of present, at least to you, a little bit of a framework that I've gone through. This is going to be one of 8 issues that at least I've thought, through of if I wanted to ruin a local church. And again, I don't want to ruin a local church, but you think through that and say, okay, if I wanted to ruin it, what would I do? Now I can fix those things, that kind of reverse engineering process. And teaching's a big one. That's been one of the areas that is the nearest and dearest to my heart. I've spent a lot of my life in Christian ministry teaching. I was a discipleship pastor for a while. I've been a senior pastor for a long time, preach most Sundays. If there's midweek stuff, again, I've taught many of those different things. And so I've thought about this, done a lot of things wrong. Still am not perfect, haven't arrived. But I like the idea of frameworks and trying to think through, ideally, where should we be headed? And so I like to know kind of what I'm aiming at. And I think that when I started in ministry, I didn't really have much that I was aiming at. I knew that there had to be a sermon every Sunday, and I kind of picked something that seemed like it was appropriate, or I would, pray, Lord, what would you have me talk about? Or I had some things on my mind or things that I noticed. And so I shared with you guys at least the brief version of the framework, which we're going to dig into and kind of unveil all of the aspects of this, which I think will take us from the big picture teaching ministry to kind of more smaller group kind of stuff, midweek type stuff, all the way down to the very granular, individualized discipleship, and really, in my opinion, covering all aspects of Christian teaching. But I wanted to start us off with something that wasn't on that sheet, 2 underlying presuppositions that I have, and I just wanted to throw these things out and get your guys' thoughts on these before we dig into the rest of the framework. Because these things, they don't make it onto the page, but they are at least in my mind as I'm thinking through this framework. And so the first one is that I think that our teaching should be very God-centered rather than man-centered. And I've written articles about this. I'll link to them down in the description box below if anybody wants to read those. They're not the longest articles I've ever written, so they are definitely shorter versions. But the long and short of it is that a lot of times, and this kind of gets back to hermeneutics, a lot of times I think that teaching and preaching can really focus on maybe the crowd that we're trying to reach. We think of, preaching to the choir. And so we're going to focus on the people, and we're going to try and say, all right, well, would they want to hear this message, or would they not want to hear this message, or will they find this relevant? And it becomes very man-centered. The kind of stereotypical example, I think there's a lot of internet memes made about it. The picture of David Goliath, and you're like this, there's an arrow pointing to Goliath, and there's saying it's him, and then there's a picture pointing to David, and it's like, that's not you. And, David and Goliath is a story that can be preached and taught in a very God-centered way. Or it can be about you and what are your emotional obstacles or your financial obstacles or whatever else. And so I come from that presupposition, trying to be God-centered rather than man-centered. And sometimes that means that I'm going to preach on texts that, maybe you look at it and you go, I don't even know the immediate relevance of this. But a book like Leviticus, for example, it's hard to make a case that this is immediately relevant to a Gentile New Covenant audience if I'm preaching a man-centered message. But if I'm preaching a God-centered message, then God has inspired this for a reason, and that becomes something valuable that I don't want to exclude. In broad strokes, that's God-centered versus man-centered. What do you guys think about that? I mean, Pastor Eric, I'm interested to hear your thoughts maybe first as a pastor. Do you try and be that way, or do you ever feel that kind of pressure maybe to preach to the choir and hit those spiritual talking points, that the congregation expects or something like that?
Well, I think I have probably wrestled with the temptation at a time in the past to maybe tell people what I thought they might want to hear. Fortunately, I've been able to resist that. As a matter of fact, I've actually kind of swung the opposite way, and maybe even too far sometimes. But I think, again, like you said, when you brought up Leviticus, that's a great point. I think some people are maybe offended if a message doesn't apply directly to their nuanced situation that they're in at the time. And frankly, preaching just can't always be that way. Now, there are times when you're going to preach and you're going to be touching on a subject that does apply directly to somebody, does fit their situation well. But I think rather than trying to fit every message perfectly into every life situation that people are going through, which is impossible, we just need to go through Scripture and realize everything in Scripture has its purpose. God never Uh, he never inspired anything for no reason. There was always a purpose behind it. Books like Leviticus and others that might, on the surface, seem irrelevant, did have a purpose. And so I think it's important to preach the word. And if someone says, "Well, that message didn't apply directly to me today," then I would say the world doesn't revolve around you. Um, there are messages that are just going to be some messages are not going to be as relevant as others, but we need to preach the word and preach it, in its entirety if we can, and just focus on that. So I think we need to be focused on, like you said, it has to be God centered, and we need to avoid the temptation to try and please man.
Can I ask just a clarifying question? You said that, because I agree with you, I think 100% of what you said, but there's one thing that I would articulate slightly differently. And so I just want to drill down on that a second. I definitely agree that the world does not revolve around me or you or any other individual. But would you say that these things that aren't, maybe don't feel as relevant, that they aren't relevant, that they're actually irrelevant? Or would you maybe qualify that? I would probably qualify that saying that they're maybe not immediately relevant, but that
Sure.
there is still a reason that God has inspired this. And so your present circumstance might not even make it abundantly clear why we need to understand a book like Leviticus currently. But as we keep walking with the Lord over time, it becomes more apparent. Oh, I understand. Now this makes sense why I would need to know this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. When I said not relevant, I just meant that it might not apply directly, immediately to the situation that they're in. If they're,
Yeah.
I may preach a message that's not about, I don't know, it's not about temptation or something like that, and maybe they're struggling with temptation in a certain way. So I guess that's what I meant. Of course, everything in the Bible has meaning, and it's important in some way because God saw fit to include it in His Word. So everything has meaning. Everything should be addressed, and that's the way I see it.
Yeah, no, I figured you would agree with that. I would have been shocked, I suppose, if you said, "No, I think there are parts of the Bible that are irrelevant, but we should preach them anyway." I didn't think that's what you meant, but I wouldn't want anybody watching to maybe interpret you that way. So,
Sure.
What about you, Greg? You have any thoughts? You have opportunity to preach and teach sometimes. It's probably not your goal, although maybe it is. I doubt that your local church leadership would put you in the position of saying, "All right, there's some real issue. Let's throw Greg up there to deal with this, and then we'll take all the softballs." But
bunch of cowards.
Yeah. But when you come to church to submit to the teaching ministry, and then also on the relatively infrequent compared to Eric and I, but certainly much more than many church members, do you factor in man-centered versus God-centered thoughts at all, or is that not something that kind of registers with you? How do you think about these things we're discussing?
I think there's a way we could express this that would be wrong. I've agreed with everything that both of you guys have said so far. And I guess in my mind, the way I would phrase this is that the Sunday morning preaching is for you. It's about God.
Mm-hmm.
When the Bible reveals something about you, it's most often revealing your weakness, your need, and I'll say our. That way I'm not pointing the finger.
Sorry, you can talk directly about me if you want. That's
fine. Well, it's finally the opportunity.
You air all the grievances.
Well, I've got a list, so
that's good.
Yeah. No, it's the Bible as it reveals us. It's revealing our weakness. It's revealing our need. It's revealing our dependency. It's not about us. It's about God. It's a revelation of who He is. It's a revelation of His holiness. It's a revelation of what He has done on our behalf, His grace, His mercy. And so it absolutely should be for the people. It's not necessarily about the people. But then we could say, well, then does it ever apply? Well, of course it applies. We are talking about your God. So absolutely it's going to apply. Now, it may not, as you've already expressed, it may not be clear how it's directly applicable to your financial crisis that you're going through. But I would almost want to argue, listen, if we're talking about God, that applies to your financial crisis that you are going to. So and now a Sunday morning sermon, if we're talking about sermons right now, a Sunday morning sermon your pastor, brothers and sisters in Christ, your pastor is not omniscient. So he doesn't know every issue that every individual is going through and couldn't possibly hope to address all of those needs in one Sunday morning, which is why, preaching through large sections of text, entire books of the Bible, is so helpful, because eventually he's going to touch on something you need. So sit there faithfully and participate faithfully as a member of the body.
Yeah. Now, those are really, really great points and very well said. I agree with everything that you said 100%. And certainly I wouldn't want anybody who's listening to this to think that when I say that at least for me, an underlying principle should be that we're talking about God-centered teaching and preaching. Of course, that does apply to the Sunday morning service. That would apply to all of the teaching ministry in general. And that is going to be applicational. That is going to have application for us as individuals, just like any other relationship that we have. If all of us are married men, we learn information about our spouses. That information is about them, but does have relevance for us because this is a person that we are in relationship with. And so if I learn that my wife's favorite color is lime green, that doesn't necessarily mean that I should, make everything in my life lime green necessarily, but it does understand, okay, now as I walk in life with this person, there are certain things that please her. And now that does have effect on areas of my life that I maybe not even immediately relevant, kind of what I was talking about with Eric. So the more that we learn about God, the more we understand that you're right. This actually might apply to my financial situation more than I initially thought, rather than just here's a 6 principles about your money from Proverbs kind of series or something like that.
Yeah.
So very well said. Actually, the second point of what you made transitions very well into the second principle that is an underlying thing, that, pastors are not omniscient. And I'm glad that you said that. I'm glad that you recognize that. I think that sometimes, especially if we are very self-centered, and I don't say that to take shots at people. By nature, we are inherently selfish. But when I come to church, church isn't about me. And I think this gets to an overall understanding of ecclesiology. So much of my life can be about me. I can read a self-help book on my own. I can seek out, teaching on my particular crises of, my financial crisis or my emotional crisis or whatever else. I can seek that stuff out in my own time. But when we gather together, that's something that I can't do on my own. Like by definition, I can't gather together with others alone. That's not a possibility. So the public gathering, if I listen to a message, and I haven't always been a pastor. So when I would attend church, if the message wasn't immediately about, something that I was going through, I could have the grace to think, well, maybe somebody else is going through whatever this is, and this is for them. And for whatever reason, that was more beneficial. However, from the pastoral side of it, it's interesting, the longer I do this, the more I realize that I don't know. And that doesn't mean that I lack faith in the scriptures, but I realize how many details of people's lives aren't shared with me. I realize how many situations can elude my notice. I realize how many, I can get focused in on something and it can make me oblivious to something else. That's just a possibility. And one of the experiences that actually really opened my eyes to this was fairly early on in my preaching ministry. I did a lot more kind of topical preaching back then. I didn't preach all the way through books. I kind of jumped around. And I remember there was an issue that had caught my attention. And so I was preaching, and I was preaching from the book of James. And I was praying actually on Saturday night about the message. And it occurred to me, I was like, I think that I've actually preached on this before. And so I looked in I used a manuscript back then, and I kind of did like a quick search, and I found it. And I had actually preached the exact same passage, the exact same text. I had titled it the same because we did bulletins back then. So I'd already put in my title, titled it the same. And it was almost exactly a year ago. Like I had, because the way the calendar works, it's not the exact same one, but it was like the same third Sunday in October, basically kind of a thing. And I was like, man, I'm about to preach the exact, like I'm on a 1-year cycle. If I'm going to rely on preaching and being reactive to what I see, I'm so limited that I'm going to just end up preaching the same things over and over and over again. And there's so much stuff that I'm never going to get to. So the second principle that kind of underlies this discussion is, as a pastor, I do think theoretically, ideally, I want to be more proactive than reactive. That means I want to have a system of trying to teach the body that I'm tasked with being an overseer of comprehensively the entire scripture. I do eventually want to teach Genesis to Revelation in a way that is reasonable, that isn't going to think that somebody has to be with me for 50 years or something to get all that teaching. And so I want to have some sort of comprehensive idea for making sure that we don't miss the book of Nahum all the time, or that I never preach on Habakkuk or something like that. That doesn't mean that I would never be willing to press pause and deal with some major issue. So there are instances where, something becomes so obvious that it needs to be addressed. And much of the New Testament documents are about that. Like there was something that was so obvious that needed to be addressed right now. So I'm not saying we can't ever do that, but I do want my overall teaching ministry to be more proactive rather than reactive. I don't want to spend, 40 years, 50 years preaching and teaching in the church, constantly dealing with issues after the fact, rather than trying to lay that broad foundation so that when the wind and waves come, it doesn't knock the house down.
Because an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
If you've taught your people to honor God with their finances well, the opportunity or the likelihood of needing to get out of that crisis ought to be less as they exercise wisdom and responsibility, and good stewardship.
Yeah, no, well said. And so there's many proverbs that do speak of that, of the wisdom of taking care of an issue before it becomes a 5-alarm fire kind of a thing. So Eric, what about you? Do you feel the same about that, or is that would you say it differently? How do you think about being proactive rather than reactive in preaching and teaching?
I think you're right. Actually, I ran into that same problem years ago. I think maybe the first few years I started preaching, I would do like topical messages that I thought were important, and I think some of them were. But the problem was, like you said, is if we're addressing problems in the church and specific things, then you end up doing the same message over and over and over again. So assuming the problems remain. So I realized that was not the best way to preach, and there was a better way. So I started doing expository preaching, where I would take a book and I would cover the book section by section. When I say sections, I don't mean chapters, but sometimes I did. But by section, I mean like there are ideas within a chapter. Sometimes individual ideas within a chapter, and I would touch on those ideas. And sometimes it was maybe 5 verses, 8 verses at a time that I would touch on. And then I would just go through entire books like that. I think there was a few years ago, we spent, I don't know, 2.5 years going through 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And maybe that was too long, I don't know, but I covered it verse by verse, covered 1 Corinthians, every single verse, and then went into 2 Corinthians. So it took some time, and but that way, you're covering so much ground, and you're covering all different kinds of subjects. So you're like you said, you're laying the teaching out there in advance, and then if something arises, well, then most likely someone has already heard some teaching on that already, and they can go back and remember the teaching that they had learned. So that's expository preaching is what I've done for several years now.
Another problem with the topical format, or maybe the reactive format, is the potential. And I guess that you guys have seen this happen at some point. If you're chasing issues and preaching on issues, people know when they're being talked directly to in a sermon. And unfortunately, I've seen it happen where somebody's, let's say there's a marital problem, and the next Sunday the preacher gets up and starts hammering on marital issues. And even if and of course they're not calling these people out by name, but people feel scandalized by that.
Yeah.
And so, man, if you're going to chase problems, you have to be very, very careful with that. And so, for those listening who aren't pastors and preachers, and you probably outnumber those who are, for the most part, I'd say your pastor's trying to be helpful. They're trying to do a good thing. They're probably just ill-advised in some of that.
Yeah. No, I think that is a great potential warning to avoid a pitfall of ever weaponizing the pulpit. And from the pastoral side of it, I think sometimes people don't realize that pastors can be wounded just as easily as church members. In fact,
maybe even more so.
It's possible. It can be lonely and difficult in pastoral ministry for sure. And so, to give someone a microphone and a pulpit, and then they've got some thing that they're upset about, you can't justify it, even if you can understand why some might do it. And so it needs to be avoided at all costs. The pulpit is not the place for beating people up or exposing problems in that man-centered way.
That said, if it happens, try to exercise some grace towards your pastor.
Sure.
Especially a younger guy. If we're talking about a 70-year-old, well, he's probably got other issues. But
he probably should have learned that lesson a long time
He probably
ago.
should have. He's probably hard-hearted. Hard-headed, anyways.
So you guys have mentioned both expository versus topical preaching, and I want to drill down on those because not everybody uses that exactly the same. But I think this other issue that's right before us, defining the terms of a healthy church isn't one that is devoid of problems, and so every church is going to have problems, and there's always going to be a risk if you're going to preach the Bible in all of its entirety. Then maybe sometimes people think you're talking about them because you are talking about some issue that they're like, oh no, have I been found out? And I think that one of the things when you do a topical series rather than a book by book, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, theme by theme, and you're not skipping anything, you at least do open yourself up for more accusations of that type, because it could be coincidence that you just met with a couple as a pastor and they exposed to you some of their marital issues, and you are keeping that in confidence, and you already had on your calendar the marriage series and you already talking about that, and then they think that you're talking about them even though you're not. That's a possibility. Whereas if you are just preaching through a book and you get to a passage, I had this happen. We were preaching through the book of Acts, and we were talking about like a church split and some of the issues that were going on. I think we were in Acts chapter 6. I think this is I might be getting some of my details mixed up, but I know Acts chapter 6, talks about the difficulties between the Hellenistic Jews and the Grecian Jews and not getting the food. And so I was talking about some of that, and afterwards people were like, all right, what's really going on? I was like, what are you talking about? They're like, is there like a split about to happen or something? I was like, no, that's just the text. Like
chapter 6 followed chapter 5.
Look at what we preached last week, and then next week I'll be in chapter 7. And so this is the proactive nature, right? But if all of a sudden I'm like, all right, we're going to push pause, and now we're teaching on this, and there's this division that's going on, and people are like, what's going on? What's really going on? And so if you're in the book of Ephesians already, and previously you were in one chapter, and then you're talking about husbands and wives and all that kind of stuff, it's much less likely that you're going to be accused of using that as a weapon, because you're continuing through the book and you're teaching the passages as they come. So I do appreciate that, and I think that that's helpful for a lot of reasons, because it's not going to get misinterpreted. Hey, thanks for watching this clip of the Exalted Christ One Accord podcast. If you like what you've seen here, click here to catch the full episode, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future content.